studied humans for 31 years. I was assigned to the Terran Behavioral Analysis Division of the Concord's Diplomatic Bureau when I was young enough to think the assignment was a punishment. Among my people, the Sathani, the study of alien psychology, is considered a secondary discipline. The real careers are in resource negotiation, fleet architecture, territorial arbitration. Behavioral analysis is where they put the ones who ask too many questions and not enough of the right kind. I was that kind. So they gave me humanity, and humanity gave me the only question I have never been able to answer properly. Despite 3 decades of study, 14 published analyses, and more direct observation hours than any non-human in the Concord's registry. The question is simple. Every species in the Concord finds it simple to ask and impossible to resolve once they have spent enough time around humans to understand what it actually means. Why do they fight for strangers? I need to define the terms carefully because precision matters here and the implications widen with every layer of examination. Among the Sathani, and among the majority of the Concord's 412 member species, the willingness to risk one's life is governed by proximity of genetic or social bond. You fight for your offspring, you fight for your mate, you fight for your clan, your pod, your hive, your political unit, depending on the species. The circle of those for whom you are willing to die is defined by reciprocity, kinship, or contractual obligation. This is not considered selfish. It is considered rational. The evolutionary logic is clear and has been validated across thousands of species on thousands of worlds. You protect those who share your genetic material or who contribute directly to your survival. The further someone is from that circle, the less you are willing to sacrifice for them. This is true of the Sathani. It is true of the Rethari, the Valesi, the Kolhari, the Tayari, and every other species I have studied in my career. It is a constant, a biological and social constant so universal that the Concord's behavioral models treat it as axiomatic. The models have been refined over 12,000 years. They work. They predict behavior across every known sapient species with an accuracy rate above 96%. Humans violate this axiom routinely, not occasionally, not under extreme circumstances, not as isolated acts of aberration that can be categorized as psychological outliers. Routinely, consistently, across cultures, across centuries, across every social and political configuration their species has produced. They fight for strangers. They die for strangers. They run toward danger that does not threaten them personally to help individuals they have never met and will never meet again. And they do this not as saints or heroes celebrated for their rarity, but as ordinary people responding to what they consider a basic obligation. They do not think of it as extraordinary. That is perhaps the most disorienting part. They consider it normal. They consider it so normal that they are confused when other species do not do the same. I first encountered this behavior directly on the human colony world of Thessaly during my second year of field observation. Thessaly is a mid-sized settlement, approximately 200,000 inhabitants, located in a system that the humans colonized roughly 40 years before my arrival. The colony had experienced a geological event, a subsurface magma shift that destabilized a residential district built on a basalt shelf above a river valley. The shelf fractured along a fault line that the colony's geological surveys had classified as low risk. Approximately 1,200 structures, homes, schools, workshops, medical facilities, collapsed or were in immediate danger of collapse. The event occurred at midday local time. Estimated casualties from the initial collapse were between 80 and 120. What happened next is what I was not prepared for. Within 14 minutes of the collapse, humans from adjacent districts began moving toward the disaster zone. Not emergency personnel, not trained responders, not people with any professional obligation to be there. Civilians. People who had been eating lunch, walking to appointments, working in offices and shops a kilometer or more from the affected area. They heard the sound of the collapse. They felt the ground shift, and they moved toward it. Not away from it, toward it. I want to be precise about this because the directionality is the point. Every survival instinct described in the Concord's behavioral literature says that a sapient organism, upon detecting a catastrophic environmental event, moves away from the source. These humans moved toward it. I was observing from a diplomatic liaison office on the opposite side of the settlement. I had access to the colony's sensor network, which provided real-time imagery and personnel tracking. I watched a man who appeared to be in his 60s leave a restaurant still holding his napkin and run toward a building that was visibly unstable. Its southern wall cracked from foundation to roofline, with dust still falling from the upper floors. He entered the building. He emerged 4 minutes later carrying a child who was bleeding from a head wound. He went back in. He emerged again with an elderly woman leaning on his shoulder, her legs unable to support her weight fully. The building collapsed 9 minutes after his second exit. He sat on the ground beside the woman, breathing heavily, covered in concrete dust, and he did not appear to consider what he had done remarkable. He was a retired school teacher. The child and the woman were not related to him. He did not know their names. I confirmed this afterward because I needed to understand the connection, and there was none. No kinship, no friendship, no contractual relationship, no community debt, no prior interaction of any kind. He did not know them. He risked his life to retrieve them from a failing structure because they were inside it and he was nearby. I recorded this incident and flagged it for analysis. Then I recorded 12 more incidents of the same kind over the following 6 hours. People pulling strangers from rubble with their bare hands. People running into dust clouds with improvised tools, pipes, and boards used as levers to lift collapsed beams. A woman directing traffic away from an unstable overhang while standing under it herself, refusing to move until the road was clear. A teenager carrying medical supplies from an undamaged clinic 2 kilometers away on foot because the transport grid was down. A group of miners from the settlement's extraction operation who had been off shift and sleeping when the collapse occurred, arriving at the disaster zone with heavy equipment they had driven from the mine site without authorization from their employer. They had simply taken the equipment and come. Their employer filed a complaint the following week. The miners paid the fine without contesting it. The colony's formal emergency services arrived within 30 minutes and assumed coordination. But by that time, the civilian response had already extracted over 300 people from damaged structures. Untrained, unequipped, uncoordinated civilians, operating on what I can only describe as an instinct that I had no model for, and that contradicted every model I had been trained to apply. I filed my first report on this phenomenon, entitled it Anomalous Altruistic Response in Terran Disaster Behavior. The word anomalous was a mistake. It was not anomalous. It was standard. I simply did not know that yet. Over the next 3 years, I observed 11 more incidents of varying scale in which humans risked their lives for individuals with no relational connection to them. A cargo pilot who diverted her ship to respond to a distress signal from a vessel she had never encountered, belonging to a crew she did not know, in a shipping lane she did not normally use. She arrived to find the vessel venting atmosphere and its crew incapacitated by a containment failure. She docked manually in conditions that her flight recorder later confirmed were at the edge of her vessel's structural tolerances, transferred the crew to her cargo bay, and transported them to the nearest station. The rescue cost her 11 hours of transit time, a significant fuel expenditure, and a contractual penalty for late delivery of her cargo. When I asked her why she had responded to the signal, she looked at me with an expression I have since learned to recognize as the one humans use when they believe a question is so obvious that it must be a misunderstanding. She said, "Because they needed help. Because they needed help." 4 words. I have turned those 4 words over in my analysis for 28 years, and I have not exhausted their implications. I began to collect data systematically after Thessaly. I examined human historical records, military archives, medical logs, disaster response databases, and sociological studies spanning approximately 4,000 years of their recorded civilization. The pattern was consistent across every period I examined. In every era, in every political system, in every cultural context, humans demonstrated a willingness to fight, to suffer, and to die for individuals outside their immediate circle of bond. The scale varied, the methods varied, the cultural framing varied enormously, but the underlying behavior was constant. It appeared in their earliest recorded histories, and it appeared in their most recent colonial records, and it showed no sign of diminishing. Soldiers throwing themselves on explosive devices to shield comrades they had known for weeks, not years. Civilians hiding persecuted strangers in their homes during periods of political violence, at risk of their own execution. Medical workers traveling to regions ravaged by disease, knowing they would likely be infected, to treat populations they had no connection to. Firefighters entering structures they knew would collapse for the chance of saving one person they had never met. Ordinary people diving into freezing water, running into burning vehicles, stepping between armed aggressors and their targets, shielding children with their bodies. Not their own children, other people's children, children they had never seen before and would never see again. The Concord's behavioral models had no category for this. I proposed one. I called it non-reciprocal threat engagement, which I defined as the voluntary acceptance of mortal risk for the benefit of an individual with whom the actor has no genetic, social, contractual, or political bond, and from whom no reciprocal benefit can be expected. My colleagues at the Bureau reviewed the definition and accepted it as technically accurate. They then asked me how frequently the behavior occurred in human populations. I told them it was ubiquitous. They did not believe me, not because they thought I was dishonest, because the claim was incompatible with every evolutionary and behavioral model the Concord had developed over 12,000 years of multi-species study. A species in which individuals routinely sacrifice themselves for non-kin should not be evolutionarily stable. The behavior should be selected against over generations. Individuals who die for strangers leave fewer offspring than those who preserve themselves. Over sufficient generations, the trait should diminish and eventually disappear. The models were clear. The mathematics were clear. And the humans were standing there, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, pulling strangers out of rubble and diving into frozen rivers, as if the mathematics did not apply to them. My supervisor, a senior analyst named Kethis Vorn, suggested that I was misinterpreting the data. He proposed that the behavior was performative, that humans engaged in apparent altruism for social reward, for status enhancement, for reproductive advantage, for the expectation of future reciprocity from the broader community. This is how altruism functions in every other known species. The individual appears to sacrifice, but the sacrifice generates a return that exceeds the cost over the actor's lifetime. Kethis argued that human altruism would follow this pattern once I corrected for cultural variables and examined the long-term social outcomes for the actors involved. I spent 2 years testing his hypothesis rigorously. I examined cases where the altruistic actor died, because death eliminates future reciprocity permanently. I examined cases where the actor was anonymous, because anonymity eliminates social reward. I examined cases where the actor explicitly stated that they expected nothing in return, and I cross-referenced those statements against their subsequent behavior to check for concealed strategic benefit. I examined cases across dozens of human cultures with radically different social reward structures to control for cultural incentive variation. The result was unambiguous. In approximately 31% of the lethal risk altruistic events I cataloged, the actor received no social benefit, no reciprocal advantage, no genetic propagation benefit, and no future return of any kind. They acted, they risked or lost their lives, and the only beneficiary was a stranger who survived because of their action. In a further 23% of cases, the potential for social benefit existed in theory, but the actor demonstrably did not calculate it in advance. They acted impulsively, instinctively, without the deliberation that strategic altruism requires. Their neurological data, where available, showed activation of motor centers before analytical centers. They moved before they thought. 54% of human altruistic risk events could not be explained by self-interest. Kethis reviewed my data. He did not challenge the methodology. He said, quietly and with an expression I interpreted as professional discomfort, that if the data was correct, then humans operated on a motivational architecture that the Concord had no framework to describe. I agreed. He asked me what I thought the architecture was. I told him I did not know. He asked me to find out. I have been trying to find out ever since. The next major shift in my understanding came during the Thessaly border crisis, which occurred approximately 8 years into my assignment. A territorial dispute between the Human Colonial Administration and a Valesi mining consortium had escalated into a low-intensity military standoff along a contested border approximately 400 kilometers from the main Thessaly settlement. The Valesi had deployed enforcement units to secure mining claims they considered legally valid under Concord resource law. The humans had deployed colonial defense forces to protect settlements they considered directly threatened by Valesi operations. Both sides were armed. Neither side had fired. The situation was, in diplomatic terminology, stabilized but volatile, the kind of standoff that could persist for months or collapse into violence in minutes. During the standoff, a Valesi enforcement vessel experienced a catastrophic drive failure in the contested zone. The vessel lost propulsion and atmospheric containment simultaneously. 31 Valesi personnel were aboard. They had approximately 9 minutes of emergency air remaining. The nearest Valesi vessel capable of performing a rescue was 47 minutes away at maximum speed. A human patrol ship, the colonial defense vessel Harlow, was 14 minutes away. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Velesi were, at that moment, the opposing force in an active military standoff with the humans. The Harlow's crew had been deployed specifically to defend against Velesi incursion. The Velesi personnel aboard the failing vessel were members of an enforcement unit that days earlier had issued formal warnings to human settlements to vacate disputed territory or face removal. They were, by any tactical definition, the enemy. The Harlow's captain, a woman named Commander Dana Osei, did not hesitate. Her ship's log shows no deliberation period between receiving the Velesi distress signal and issuing her order. She directed her vessel to the Velesi position at maximum speed. Her executive officer raised a tactical objection. Approaching a Velesi vessel in the contested zone risked being fired upon by other Velesi units who might interpret the approach as hostile. Commander Osei acknowledged the risk in a single sentence and maintained course. The Harlow reached the disabled vessel in 11 minutes. Osei's crew performed an emergency docking procedure in conditions that the subsequent inquiry described as technically reckless and practically necessary. They transferred all 31 Velesi personnel to the Harlow, provided medical treatment for 9 who were suffering from atmospheric deprivation, and held position until a Velesi recovery vessel arrived to take custody of the survivors. The entire operation took 43 minutes. During that time, the Harlow was within weapons range of 3 Velesi enforcement ships, any one of which could have destroyed it. None of them fired. It was later reported through diplomatic channels that the Velesi unit commander had ordered weapons hold because she was unable to reconcile the tactical situation with the behavioral data her training provided. A human warship had broken defensive formation during an active standoff to rescue enemy personnel. The Velesi commander did not know what to do with that information. Her models, like ours, had no category for it. Neither did anyone else. The Thessaly border crisis was resolved diplomatically 6 weeks later. The resolution was attributed in the official record to a series of negotiating concessions by both parties. In the unofficial record, which I have access to through the Bureau's classified archives, the resolution was attributed primarily to the Harlow incident. The Velesi negotiating team reported to their government that they were dealing with a species whose military personnel would risk their own lives to save enemy combatants during active hostilities, and that this behavior appeared to be genuine rather than strategic. The Velesi government's response was to lower their posture significantly, not out of gratitude, out of uncertainty. They did not know how to model a species that would do that, and uncertainty in Velesi political culture produces caution rather than aggression. I reported the Harlow incident to the Bureau with Commander Osei's full post-action testimony appended. I will reproduce the relevant portion here because I've read it perhaps 100 times over the years and it has not lost its weight. She said, "I understood the tactical risk. I understood that approaching a Velesi vessel during the standoff could be interpreted as aggression and could escalate the situation beyond recovery. I understood that my crew's safety was my primary responsibility under colonial defense regulations. But there were 31 people on that ship who were going to die in 9 minutes if nobody came, and I was close enough to come. That's it. That's the entire calculation. They were going to die. I could get there, so I went. They were going to die. I could get there, so I went." I included this testimony in my report without commentary, because I had no commentary adequate to the statement. The Bureau's review panel read the report, and one of them, a senior analyst from the Marani species whose name I will not disclose for professional reasons, wrote in the margin of the official response document a single line. "Are we certain this is not doctrinal, religious, genetic coercion? There must be a mechanism. There must be a mechanism." That is the question the conquered keeps asking. Every species that encounters human altruism for the first time asks precisely the same thing in precisely the same tone. There must be a reason. There must be a compulsion. There must be a biological override, a cultural program, a religious commandment, a social enforcement structure that forces humans to behave this way. Because if there is not, if this behavior is voluntary, individual, and self-generated, then something fundamental about the way the conquered understands sapient motivation is incomplete at best and wrong at worst. I spent the next decade looking for the mechanism. I studied human neurochemistry in collaboration with their own medical researchers, who were generous with data and often amused by my line of inquiry. I examined their stress response hormones, their social bonding systems, their neurological reward pathways. I found that humans do experience a neurochemical reward for altruistic behavior, a release of compounds they call endorphins and oxytocin that produces a sensation of satisfaction or emotional warmth. This was initially encouraging. A neurochemical reward could explain the behavior as a form of sophisticated self-interest. The human helps others because helping produces a pleasurable internal state that the organism seeks to repeat. But the explanation collapsed under scrutiny. The neurochemical reward for altruism is modest. It is substantially weaker than the neurochemical reward for self-preservation. The fear response, the pain response, the survival instinct, all of these produce signals that vastly overpower the altruistic reward in both intensity and speed. A human who runs into a burning building to save a stranger is doing so against the overwhelming neurochemical instruction of their own body, which is telling them, in every way a nervous system can communicate, to run in the opposite direction. The altruistic reward does not override the survival instinct. It is not strong enough. The human overrides the survival instinct despite the altruistic reward being insufficient to explain the override, which means the mechanism is not chemical. It is not hormonal. It is not a biological compulsion operating below the level of conscious decision. It is a choice, a decision made in a fraction of a second against the body's own urgent instructions to accept risk or death for the benefit of someone who is not kin, not friend, not ally, not contractual partner, not member of the same political unit, a stranger, a complete stranger. That is where part 1 of this account ends, because that is where my understanding reached a boundary that took me another 15 years to cross. I knew, by the end of that first decade and a half, that humans fought for strangers. I knew the behavior was genuine, voluntary, and widespread across their entire species. I knew it could not be explained by self-interest, reciprocity, genetic advantage, or neurochemical compulsion. And I knew that the Concord's 12,000-year behavioral framework had no mechanism, no model, and no category for it. What I did not yet understand was why it terrified us, not confused us, not puzzled us, terrified us. That understanding came later, and it changed everything I believed about the balance of power in the galaxy. The terror did not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulated. It built the way sediment builds, one thin layer at a time, until the weight of what had settled became impossible to ignore. And the moment I finally understood what the Concord was afraid of, I was not in a laboratory or a briefing room. I was at a funeral. The funeral was for a human named Corporal James Mwangi. He had been serving on a joint Concord peacekeeping deployment on a world called HFY, a planet in the process of being admitted to the Concord under a supervised integration program. HFY was experiencing internal conflict. 2 indigenous factions were disputing territorial boundaries, and the Concord had deployed a multinational stabilization force to maintain a ceasefire. The force included contingents from the Sethani, the Velesi, the Kolhari, and a small human unit attached as part of a diplomatic exchange intended to give humans experience with Concord military operations. The humans were there in an advisory and observational capacity. They were not tasked with direct engagement. Their rules of engagement specified that they were to defend themselves if attacked, but were not authorized to intervene in the local conflict beyond their advisory role. This was clear. It was written. It was briefed. Every human in the unit understood it. On the 43rd day of the deployment, a ceasefire violation occurred in a civilian district approximately 12 kilometers from the human unit's position. One of the indigenous factions attacked a settlement belonging to the other. The attack was directed at a civilian population center, not a military target. Approximately 2,000 non-combatants were in the settlement. The nearest Concord peacekeeping unit, a Kolhari rapid response detachment, was 38 minutes away. The human unit was 12 minutes away. Corporal Mwangi's commanding officer, a lieutenant named Park, received the distress call from the settlement at 09:14 local time. Park assessed the situation, reviewed the rules of engagement, and determined that direct intervention was not authorized. He communicated this to his unit. The situation was outside their mandate. The Kalahari were responding. The rules were clear. Corporal Mwangi asked how long the Kalahari would take. Lieutenant Park said 38 minutes. Mwangi asked how many civilians were in the settlement. Park said approximately 2,000. Mwangi asked what the estimated casualty rate would be over 38 minutes of unopposed attack on a civilian population. Park did not answer. Mwangi did the calculation himself. Based on the weapons being used and the population density of the settlement, he estimated that between 300 and 600 civilians would be killed in the time it took the Kolhari to arrive. Mwangi said, "Sir, I can be there in 12 minutes. Park repeated that intervention was not authorized. Mwangi acknowledged the order. He then left the compound with his weapon and his field kit, commandeered a transport vehicle, and drove to the settlement. 4 other members of his unit followed him without being ordered and without being authorized. They arrived at the settlement in 11 minutes and engaged the attacking force directly. 5 humans, lightly armed, unauthorized, operating outside their rules of engagement, against a force of approximately 140 combatants equipped with heavy weapons and armored vehicles. The engagement lasted 27 minutes, until the Kolari response force arrived and assumed control. During those 27 minutes, Mwangi and his 4 companions held a defensive position at the settlement's northern approach, the primary avenue of attack, and prevented the attacking force from entering the populated district. They accomplished this through a combination of concentrated fire, tactical movement that exploited the settlement's narrow streets, and what the Kolhari commander later described in his report as a willingness to absorb personal risk that no rational tactical assessment could justify. Mwangi was killed at minute 19. A heavy caliber round penetrated his body armor below the left shoulder. He continued to fire for another 40 seconds before losing consciousness. He was carried behind cover by one of his companions, who attempted field treatment while maintaining suppressive fire from a position that was, by any rational assessment, indefensible. Mwangi died before medical evacuation could reach him. He was 26 years old. He had been in the colonial military for 4 years. He had no personal connection to Rethus 5, no history with its people, no stake in the outcome of their internal conflict. He was there on a training assignment. The 4 remaining humans sustained injuries ranging from moderate to severe. None of them withdrew. Not one. They held their position until the Kolari arrived, and only then did they accept medical treatment. The settlement's civilian population lost 14 people in the attack. Without the human intervention, the Kolhari commander's formal estimate was that the casualty count would have exceeded 400. I attended Mwangi's funeral because I had been assigned to observe the aftermath of the incident. The funeral was held at the human unit's base, a modest facility with a parade ground that had been cleared for the ceremony. His commanding officer spoke. His colleagues spoke. A message from his family was read. It was restrained, personal, and attended by every human on the base, and, notably, by a delegation from the settlement he had defended. The Rethesian civilians had traveled 12 kilometers on foot to attend the funeral of a man from another species who had died defending them. They did not speak his language. They had never met him before the day of the attack. They stood at the edge of the parade ground, and they waited until the ceremony was finished. And then one of them, an elder from the settlement, approached Lieutenant Park and said, through a translator, that they wished to know the name of the man who had come. Park told him. The elder repeated the name, James Mwangi. He said the name 3 times slowly, as if committing it to a different kind of memory. Then he asked why Mwangi had come when it was not his duty. Park did not answer immediately. He looked at the ground for a moment, and then he said something that I recorded and that I have included in every report I have written since. He said, "It was his duty. It just wasn't in the orders." It was his duty. It just wasn't in the orders. I stood at the edge of that parade ground, a Sathani analyst in a borrowed dress uniform, and I felt something shift inside my understanding. Not a new data point, not a new category, something deeper. A recognition that the question I had been asking for 15 years was the wrong question. I had been asking why humans fight for strangers. The question assumed that fighting for strangers was the anomaly that required explanation. But standing at that funeral, watching humans weep for a man who had run towards certain death for people he had never met, I realized that the question the conquered should have been asking, the question that would have led to the terror much sooner, was not why they do it. It was what kind of species produces individuals for whom this is not a decision but an identity. Because that is the answer. That is the thing that terrified the conquered when it was finally understood. The willingness to fight for strangers is not a behavior in humans. It is not a tactic. It is not a cultural overlay that can be removed or modified. It is not a malfunction. It is not an anomaly. It is architecture. It is built into what they are at a level so fundamental that asking a human why they would die for a stranger is like asking why they breathe. They do not have a reason. They have a nature, and their nature says that if someone is in danger and they can reach them, they go. Not because of kinship, not because of contract, not because of reward. Because that is what a human does. Because to not go would be to stop being what they understand themselves to be. This is what terrifies the conquered, not the behavior itself, though the behavior is formidable enough. What terrifies the conquered is the implication. Every other species in the Concord, Concord builds its military, its alliances, its political structures on a foundation of calculated self-interest. You can predict what a Scifi fleet will do because you can model what serves Scifi interests. You can predict Velesi policy because Velesi policy follows Velesi advantage. You can predict Kolhari aggression because Kolhari aggression maps to Kolhari territorial calculus. Self-interest is predictable. Self-interest is modelable. Self-interest is the operating system on which the entire Concord's diplomatic and strategic infrastructure runs. Humans break the operating system. You cannot predict what a species will do if its members are willing to die for people they do not know. You cannot model their alliances because their alliances are not based solely on advantage. You cannot deter them with conventional threat calculus because the calculus assumes that the threatened party will weigh cost against benefit and choose preservation, and humans do not reliably do that when someone else is at risk. You cannot contain them through strategic isolation because they will form bonds with species they have no historical, genetic, or economic connection to, simply because those species needed help and the humans were close enough to provide it. The Harlow incident was the first demonstration. A human warship rescued enemy combatants during an active standoff. The strategic implication was that human military forces could not be relied upon to behave as adversaries even during adversarial engagements. The Velesi understood this and were unsettled by it. But the full scope of the implication was not grasped until later. In the 12 years following the Harlow incident, humans formed mutual defense agreements with 7 species, 3 of which had no strategic value to humanity whatsoever. They were small, isolated, technologically underdeveloped species, occupying systems of no particular resource significance. The Concord's strategic analysts could not identify a rational basis for the alliances. The humans gained nothing from defending these species. No trade advantage. No territorial buffer. No political leverage within the Concord. Nothing. When asked to explain the alliances, the Human Diplomatic Corps said that the species in question had been threatened by regional instabilities and had requested assistance. The humans considered the request legitimate and responded. That was the explanation. That was all of it. No classified strategic briefing. No hidden economic agenda uncovered by deeper analysis. The humans had been asked for help by species that could not offer them anything in return, and they had said yes. I verified this through 3 independent channels. The answer was the same each time. They were asked that they said yes. That was the entire decision-making process. The Concord Strategic Planning Division ran the numbers. If the pattern continued, if humans continued to form alliances with any species that asked for help regardless of strategic return, then within 50 years, humanity would be at the center of a network of mutual obligations that would make them the most connected species in the Concord. Not the most powerful, not the most technologically advanced, the most connected, the most allied. The species with the largest number of other species willing to fight alongside them, not because of what they could gain, but because of what the humans had already done for them. And that is the kind of power that cannot be countered by fleets or technology or economic leverage. That is the kind of power that rewrites the structure of a galactic civilization from the inside. Because once you have a species at the center of a web of genuine non-transactional alliances, every strategic calculation involving that species must account for the fact that attacking them means attacking everyone who owes them something. And the humans were accumulating debts of the kind that species remember. Not financial debts, not contractual obligations. The kind of debts that are created when someone saves your people and asks for nothing in return. The Concord Assembly convened a closed session in the 23rd year of my assignment to discuss what was internally referred to as the human alignment problem. The name was deliberately technical, the substance was not. The session lasted 11 days. I was asked to testify on 4 of them. I presented my 31 years of data. I described the Thessaly collapse, the Harlow incident, Corporal Mwangi, the 7 alliances, the neurochemical analysis that proved the behavior was voluntary, the historical record that proved it was consistent across their entire civilization. I presented my conclusion, which I had refined over 3 decades, into a single statement that I believed was accurate and complete. I said, humans possess a species-wide behavioral characteristic in which individuals are willing to accept death to protect non-affiliated strangers. This characteristic is voluntary, neurochemically uncompelled, culturally universal, historically persistent, and strategically unpredictable. It cannot be modeled using self-interest frameworks. It cannot be deterred using conventional threat calculus. And it generates alliance networks based on gratitude and moral debt, rather than strategic advantage, resulting in a connectivity profile that is, by the Concorde's own projections, the fastest growing in the galaxy. The assembly was quiet. Then a delegate from the Kolhari Collective, a species known for blunt rhetoric, asked me the question that everyone in the room wanted to ask. He said, "What do you recommend we do about it?" I told him there was nothing to do about it. I told him that the human characteristic he was concerned about was not a policy. It was not a strategy. It was not something that could be negotiated away or countered with a competing approach. It was what they were. You could no more ask humans to stop fighting for strangers than you could ask the Kolhari to stop breathing methane. It was their nature. The only question was how the Concorde chose to relate to a species whose nature made every traditional model of interstellar relations obsolete. The Kolhari delegate asked whether the humans could be trusted. I said I had spent 31 years studying them, and I believed they could be trusted more reliably than any species in the Concorde, because their loyalty was not contingent on advantage. It was contingent on proximity to suffering. If you were suffering and they could reach you, they would come. They would come if you were their ally. They would come if you were their enemy. They would come if you were a stranger on a world they had never heard of, because a distress signal reached them and they were close enough to respond. They would come. The assembly did not pass a resolution. They rarely do when the subject resists resolution. But the closed session produced an internal document that was distributed to every member species' diplomatic and military leadership. The document was classified. Its title, which I helped draft, was Strategic Implications of Non-Reciprocal Altruism in the Terran Species. The document's central conclusion, stripped of its diplomatic language, was this: humanity represents a fundamental challenge to the Concorde's operating assumptions, not because they are hostile, but because their motivational architecture makes them impossible to predict using the tools the Sol Concorde has relied on for 12,000 years. The recommended approach was engagement, integration, and the gradual restructuring of Concorde diplomatic models to account for a species that does not operate on self-interest alone. The recommendation was, in essence, to learn from them, not because they were superior, because they were different in a way that made the Concorde's existing framework incomplete, and an incomplete framework is, over sufficient time, a dangerous one. That was 7 years ago. The restructuring is underway, slowly, because the Concorde does nothing quickly, and because many species find the implications of my conclusions uncomfortable in ways they have not yet fully articulated. Human representatives now sit on 12 of the Assembly's 19 standing committees. Human military units participate in joint operations across 7 sectors. Human colonial expansion continues, and with it, the alliance network continues to grow. They now have mutual defense agreements with 23 species. 7 of those species have independently begun exhibiting increased altruistic behavior in their own populations, a social diffusion effect that the Bureau is monitoring with what I would describe as cautious fascination. 3 more species have requested human advisory missions to help restructure their emergency response systems along human models. 2 have adopted the human practice of training civilian populations for disaster response, something no Concorde species had ever done because no Concorde species had ever considered civilians as a relevant response resource. The humans taught them to see their own populations differently. That, in itself, is a form of power that no fleet can match. The humans are changing us, not through force, not through economic pressure, not through political maneuvering, through example. Through the slow, persistent, irreversible demonstration that a species can be built on something other than self-interest, and not only survive, but thrive. Through the evidence accumulated across every interaction, every rescue, every funeral, every alliance formed for no reason other than they needed help and we could get there. That there is a way of being in the galaxy that the Concorde never considered because it never seemed possible. I am old now, by Sethani standards. My career has been defined by a single subject, a single species, a single question. And I have come to believe that the question, why do humans fight for strangers, is not actually a question about humans. It is a question about us, about why we don't. About why we built a civilization across 400 worlds and 12,000 years on the assumption that no one would ever help us unless it served their interest to do so, and about what it means to discover, late in that civilization's history, that there is a species for whom that assumption is simply false. That is the terror. Not that humans are dangerous, though they are, in ways that our threat assessments consistently underestimate because the assessments are calibrated for species that protect themselves first. Not that they are unpredictable, though they are unpredictable in precisely the way that matters most to military and diplomatic planning. The terror is that they are possible. That a sapient species can evolve, can build a civilization, can survive ice ages and plagues and self-inflicted nuclear crises and the slow grind of natural selection across 200,000 years and arrive at the stars still carrying a trait that every model says should have been eliminated. Before they left their first ocean, they should not exist as they are. The mathematics say so. The models say so. 12,000 years of observed evolutionary biology across 400 species say so. The trait should have been selected against. The individuals who carry it should have been outcompeted by those who do not. The species should have arrived at sapience with the trait pruned, diminished, reduced to a vestigial instinct activated only for immediate kin. And yet, there they are, running into burning buildings, diving into frozen water, driving unauthorized transport vehicles into combat zones, breaking formation to rescue the enemy, forming alliances with species who have nothing to offer them, weeping at the funerals of people who died for strangers, building a network of gratitude and moral obligation that is quietly, without spectacle or strategy, becoming the most powerful force in the galaxy. Not because they planned it that way, because that is what happens when you help people. They remember, and they help you back. And then you help someone else, and they remember too, and the web grows. Not through calculation, but through the accumulated weight of actions taken for no reason other than the conviction that if someone is in danger and you can reach them, you go. Because they needed help. I could get there. So I went. I have studied humans for 31 years, and that is the only answer they have ever given me. It is the only answer they have. It is the only answer they need. And it is, I have come to understand, the most frightening sentence in the galaxy. Not because of what it says about the danger, because of what it says about what the rest of us have been missing.